Good evening. To kind of start with what I found interesting in Module 3, I found the reading in particular to be very interesting in addition to the videos. But I would kind of want to focus on the reading as I've done the past two times. And to kind of start off with, like, the topic that I found most interesting was the good versus bad definitions of violence and murder. And the chapter starts off with discussing how in ancient civilizations or even older civilizations, there were executions that were public display. It was very common in ancient Rome. There was the Colosseum and gladiatorial fights, and also the crucifixions after the Spartacus rebellion. And I found this kind of interesting to kind of talk about because if you look back in history during those time periods, the value of life is completely different than what we have nowadays. And I think there's a tie-in with morality, maybe. I'm not too sure. I'm not going to get super specific about that. But I found it kind of interesting how this chapter that has been talking about deviancy for so long and is now doing the talking about the violence aspect of it, it mentions this because violence is kind of interpreted based upon the societal norms at the time. And this chapter kind of portrays that very well by stating how there's subcultures and how they are benefited from wealth or how they're very much not benefited and they're going through misery and agitating times. And that's really what I found interesting during this chapter. Now, for something that kind of challenged my thinking and perspective, I would kind of have to say a little bit later on in the chapter, it's set like with the word iron quadrangle in our uh, study guide. I found that kind of interesting to kind of perceive how there's different groups going after kind of a similar goal, even though these groups don't really have anything in common. I found that kind of interesting. I want to read up more on that and kind of delve more into that. So I'd appreciate some context from who's ever watching this. Additionally, I don't really have any like super specific story personally about good versus bad violence. I mean, my family has had a lot of members in the military, and whether you can constitute what they've done in their service as good or bad varies depending upon the circumstances, such as what war they were in, and also were they following the code of conduct there, and also what they were personally believed at the time, and also the societal norms during the time period, kind of like how this chapter stated at the very beginning. So I don't really have anything super specific, but a real world example would be kind of like how I mentioned how I had family members during some of these wars that America has fought in. You can kind of perceive how Americans and the society of America perceives war and how it progresses over time. Like Vietnam, for example, in the very beginning, it was kind of, like, okay, why are we here? Most Americans didn't even know where Vietnam was. And as it progressed and escalated, more and more Americans became more and more upset with the idea of sending Americans to go die and kill in a country that has no correlation with the US whatsoever. So that's pretty much everything that I had